Guilt, shame, and the wounded child. In today's session, I'm going to talk about guilt, wounding, shame, and the wounded child, and how that can actually also, impact different areas of life, including being the wounded healer. My name is Eileen Burns. I'm a soul empowerment coach, a healer, a therapist, and a spiritual business strategist. And today I'm going to explore aspects of the wounded child in relation to particularly guilt and shame, and how that can show up in really unhealthy patterns in our life, our health, our relationships, and our work. Now, the wounded child is what we class as one of the aspects of the main survival archetypes. And the wounded child is also related to one of the core wounds, that is guilt. And guilt can show up in all sorts of ways in our life. And it's not just about guilt of maybe something that we've done or we've not done, but it can also be what we call misplaced guilt, unfounded guilt, guilt that we take on that does not belong to us, it's someone else's guilt or shame. Now, this is often a huge challenge for many empaths, particularly empaths who struggle with boundaries, self-worth issues, and self-esteem issues. And when you're an empath, particularly if you're a highly sensitive empath, you have two things going on. If you think about the highly sensitive person, they are very extreme in their sensitivity. And if we think about the empath on the scale, and obviously even within someone being a highly sensitive person or empath, there is different variations. But if you think about the empath is on the really high scale of empathy, and they often over-empathize. So one of the challenges that many empaths, for example, have is they have this misplaced guilt where they tend to feel guilty of when other people are suffering, or they feel guilty when something else has happened, and even if they're not responsible, it may be somebody that's around them or they know them, they can have these challenges and underlying unhealthy, distorted patterns that keeps them stuck and can trigger certain emotional patterns in wounding. And if you think about guilt, a lot of people have different views. I come from a strong Catholic background, and guilt was something that was very pushed on. I have to be honest, for me, I had a lot of distortions around guilt. So, and I remember it wasn't probably to later on in my life, as I became an adult, I think my parents started to realise there was some, they started to become more aware of this misplace, because I would feel really responsible and get really over emotional about other things that was not my responsibility. And I remember one situation, I have to be honest, in one level, and it felt at the time as if it was going to break me. And compared to all the other things that I dealt with in my life, for some reason, this situation really impacted me mentally, emotionally, physically on some level, spiritually, because I had a distorted perspective about it. But I worked for a charity organisation, and even though the foundation of the charity and the purpose of the charity was well-meaning, they started to do a lot of things that ethically was just so against everything that my integrity stood for, that I was at a situation in my life where there was a lot going on. So I probably was not as strong and feeling empowered to make decisions that I normally would. But at the time, I felt torn between like almost aspects of my archetypal traits and my, my core values and core winding. And I'll explain what I mean. And I think this will reflect in lots of areas of my life. So one of my core values was always, being able to support people when I can. Obviously, that can have, you can see the traits where the unhealthy guilt can come in, and guilt that's not where you feel responsible for other people's stuff when it's not really your stuff. But I was always generous-hearted and always very committed to the work I did. And if I committed to something, I'd complete and do that. And there was a lot of other things. It was a complex situation for a variety of reasons. And I wanted to leave the place right away because I felt as a soul level and a spiritual level that my values and my integrity was being compromised, even though it wasn't actually me being compromised, it was what they were doing. But for a variety of reasons, I was scared that my reputation would go down with this for a lot of reasons that was not, again, not my responsibility, but a few things that they had done to, how could you say, make someone the scapegoat. And it wasn't till a few things happened in the situation and later that I could see things through a different lens. And it wasn't also till I started to recognise, and I think other people recognised, that I had this absolute unfounded guilt about things that were not meant to carry. Did I start to look at things in a different way? Now, there can be lots of layers to that. But if we think about situations where I've met, for example, I had one client who would be the scapegoat for situations that would happen in her work environment, even though she didn't do it. And that is an example of where someone actually will be willing to take they go and kind of sacrifice themselves because she just couldn't feel the uncomfortableness of what was going to happen to other people and what was going to happen to do with that situation or these situations. So she explained, and remember, in a workshop, which was quite eye-opening to me, how much that when someone did wrong, and no matter how bad it was, and she would actually take the blame and say it was her. Now, there were some extreme situations that were so extreme that, it was mind-blowing what she was willing to sacrifice herself for. But the reality is guilt can come in all forms, and it can come, if we think about the child, these core wounds start in childhood. And although there is core wounds that can kind of come in adulthood, most core wounds start in childhood because that's where the programming starts. And they tend to be, if it's other trauma in adulthood, it's usually related to the child wounds because we all have all of the core wounds at a young age. But obviously some are more stronger than others. But if you think about what guilt and shame is, someone with very strong guilt wounding will have low self-worth, self-esteem issues, and have this, it's almost because of that, and obviously they have a lot of shame about things that are quite extreme. I know for me, shame has been a big one for me in relation to my health and well-being. And interestingly, what did I do? I attracted a lot of healers and therapists who would gaslight me. Even doctors gaslight me and shame me, and people would say things because I was, basically vibrating at that frequency of shame. Now, there's certain areas of my life that I think I feel enough, but there is certain areas like every one of us have elements where we don't feel enough. And core wounds are all linked to that, not feeling enough. But when guilt comes in, it's, it's very it can be, really very hard on yourself. The perfectionists come in, you don't, it's almost like the good girl, good this, the good that, there almost has to be that you set certain high rules and certain expectations of yourself, or there's like, a lot of self-loathing. Now, there's lots of core wounds, but I'm talking about the guilt wound today and in relation to the wounded child. And when the guilt wounding comes in, there's lots of archetypal traits that are linked to the guilt wound. And I'm not saying they just form because of the guilt wound. I think, one of the things that comes out of the guilt wound is, and the shame wound is, deep compassion and understanding and deep empathy for other people. You don't want to other people to experience the shame, the heart, the chronic self-worth, self-esteem, and emotional and physical pain that you maybe have, or maybe other people that you've loved have had. So you you do things to support, and that's where a lot of the wounded healer comes from. But the reality is, when the wounded healer is extremely unhealthy, there can be lots of tendencies. Now, I've had a situation recently, and then someone who else was involved in this situation had, was talking about, how important it is for anyone that's doing any sort of work that they have to have cleared everything before they go and do any sort of work. But the reality is, if you totally believe that a coach, healer, or therapist has cleared everything, you have no understanding of the human psyche. You have no understanding of what true healing means. It's the same as when people say, well, that person's not healed, so why, they shouldn't really be doing the work. The reality is that none of us is fully healed. We all have emotional wounding. And for some of us, it shows up more physically. Some people, it shows up more obviously in certain areas of their life. Maybe the relationships, they may avoid relationships. They may have very volatile or abusive relationships. They may be very unhappy in relationships. You might see it, they struggle, in workplace environments. They struggle to meet friends. They struggle to be part of communities, or part. They're always there's that. So we can see that type of wounding, and often that's linked to abandonment wounding and trust wounding as well. Both of those can cause different dynamics in relation to those problems. And there's also things like sovereignty wounding, which can also be linked to some of these other wounds as well. And when we lack sovereignty, we see this playing out at the moment, where a collective, I think, it's probably, I've not really started to fully understand what sovereignty started to mean in the last 10 or so years of my life, for a wee bit longer than that. I started to really, sometimes we can hear something, but understand at a conscious level and really experience it. And there's different layers to that. It's like almost you open the door to something and you kind of comprehend it on one level, but there's another layer and there's another layer, and you don't really fully understand it until you fully start embodying it and experiencing it at some level. And lack of sovereignty has been so paramount over the last few years. And when we see lack of sovereignty in a life, we allow other people to control us and disempower us. And sometimes we can have, good sovereignty in maybe one area, we struggle with others. And again, I've realised that sovereignty has been maybe a lacking area in relation to my health. There's other things that I can feel my sovereignty, and I'll stand up and I'll be counted, and you're not going to rock me about certain things. But there's, we'll have our trigger points, we'll have maybe things that are not our biggest strength. But lack of sovereignty is so paramount at the moment, because we've seen the example in the collective where even though people are saying that, if you look at organisations and powers to be and certain things are taking away people's rights and powers, most of the collective are still sitting back and allowing it to happen and not being in any way proactive or even want to face it. And, they're in avoidance, and there's lots of things that can be linked to sovereignty. But going back to shame, when we get embroiled in shame, we continue to allow shame to basically pull us down. And it can be very hard because we can have so many challenges at a collective level that's linked to guilt and shame. And if we look at even the concept of what is regarded as original sin, and maybe some of maybe unhealthy distortions that may be attached to that can really impact people's ability to have compassion for themselves, to forgive themselves and recognise that they are only human. Because when people are on self-destruct and have such self-loathing and self-esteem or self-worth issues, and they're constantly feel shame but are also shamed by others, it's not empowering. It doesn't help move people into more an empowered mindset and an empowered energy field. And one of the things that I found really hard, particularly in my early 20s, was I experienced a lot of situations where it was very traumatizing and re-traumatizing. And it was healers and therapists who meant well, but lacked awareness, lacked self-awareness, and would use a lot of gaslighting and shaming because they misunderstood some of the challenges that I was dealing with. And there was a lot of judgment, a lot of like, I'm better than you, kind of like, and I'm going to control you, and this is what you're going to do, or you're not obviously doing this, or this is what I do or I did, and no compassion, a lack of really empathy and lack of understanding. So when some of us have, we've experienced guilt and things, and that can be things that we do wrong in our life, or things that we make mistake, or bad healthy patterns, or, as I said, low self-esteem, low self-worth, or situations where we have been the victim of something, but we feel guilty because we're the victim, and we feel guilt and shame because we allowed that in our life in some sort of level, and that we've not got that perfect. It can be a hard archetypal pattern to push through. But I took part in I'm always taking part in, I'm somebody that's always open to learning and always open to seeing things from another angle, because one of the things I know about human nature is that we can be very blocked. We all have our blind spots, and we often only see the world and things through a certain lens, and there's 110,000 million different lenses out there. And one of the things reminded me about the core winds, and it reminded me about a course I used to offer that was, at the time, most, the clients and students found it really fun and creative and inspiring, and more importantly, empowering. And I've sold this as an actual then self-study course for many years, but it is a really older one of my courses. So, the content, it's not as maybe probably as polished looking as some content now. But I was reminded about this, for some reason, the course reminded me of something, and sometimes we have a lot of tools in a toolbox and we miss something. It's there, the tools there, or the awareness or something. It's just the awareness sometimes of seeing it from a different angle. And it reminds me how empowering the students and the course found this course, but not just that. It was, even though it kind of helped, it brought up people's wounding and challenging. It was not that, not too heavy, it was not that heavy way that a lot of shadow work can be. And people found it fun. They found it therapeutic in a more relaxed way, and just the way I did it. And for that reason, I decided to bring back this workshop, slightly change it a little bit, and up level it a bit with some of the other things. And I suppose my deeper awareness and insight that I have now. I mean, that might have been, I'm trying to think if that course is, it might be older than 6 years old. It might be about 8 years old. But I'm running Empowering Your Inner Child, which is about healing the adult you through fairy tale writing and creative writing. And like everyone, I have my own methodology how I use things. I use a combination of inner child, psychotherapy, and spiritual approaches, archetype approaches, and spiritual healing. And when we understand and we can see things like our wounding, our core wounds, whatever that is, our guilt wounding, our shame wounding, or even some of the other wounding that I will be talking about, is that sometimes by seeing it at the conscious level, right, and seeing it more objectively, because sometimes there's so many different types of modalities that deal with unconscious beliefs and unconscious emotions, but sometimes they don't go as far back as the basic wounding and the themes, the constructs. There's all different types of constructs, right, and different levels to constructs. And sometimes you get one angle, and you see one angle, but you don't see the other layers that's embroiled and get involved in maybe another core wound. And one of the fun things about this form of creative writing, the way that I do it, is that it's helped people take a really simple approach to be able to access at that point, because core ones play out, but there's certain things that show up at certain times of our life for certain reasons and show up in a certain way, and they're stronger. But this course is one of those courses that you can go back and do over and over again for all sorts of scenarios, and like kind of almost you can do it for all sorts of triggers, but also core wounds. And when we see things from a different level of consciousness, first of all, it's like almost when you see things from a higher perspective, when you can look down and see all the constructs and patterns in your life, and see the repeated patterns, and see a theme, and see it from not just the egoic perspective, the human perspective, we can actually see it from a more spiritual, empowering perspective, where you actually see the gifts in that situation. Because sometimes when we look at our guilt, our shame, or any type of wounding that is keeping us in a pattern, we get further into his look because we're looking at the negative aspects, the negative constructs, the things that keep pulling us down and keep attracting certain people in life, keep attracting certain situations, keep attracting certain tests in our life, right? But when we look at it as a gift and we can see it from all angles and from deeper spiritual angles, and even purpose to do with sometimes a mission and a purpose, and when we can see it from how certain things play out and why they play out, there is something much more empowering, and it's almost helping us to see the hero's journey. So, if this is something that you're interested in, we're in April now, and this is actually going to run April the 20th, and it's a Saturday in the following week. It's actually a 3-hour workshop, but it's split in 2 sections. And with each live session, then you have some work, basically some light-hearted work to do between, the first week and the next week. And it's all about then help you create a more empowering narrative and looking at, things from a fresh, more wiser and a higher perspective, and how we can shift out of those old core wins. So it would be great to see you join me in this course, and this course will obviously be available as a self-study course after the live runs. But just remember, guilt wounding and shame wounding is one of the mere core wins, and it is not something that has to completely grip over your life. I know the guilt one of a lot of things, a lot of this imploding, and it was like imploding in constant guilt, that to a really extreme level. It's definitely really subsided in my life to a different degree, and I'm not saying there's other things that have creeped up in relation to some other wounding that sometimes can be interlinked. But one of the things that I do know, that even me doing when I do these classes myself, we always have aha moments in relation to our own wounding, because there's something very interesting that happens when a group comes together and their own wounds show up and their own gifts and their superpowers show up, is that at a collective level, it represents other aspects that are going on with us all, and it helps us see things from completely different angles. And when you bring a group together, everyone gets to be able to share. It's like almost different. If you can imagine, it's like all these mirrors and all these different angles, and opens us up to that higher and wider perspective. And it's always remembering that our wounding was there at one point to protect us at some level, and obviously you want to move from that wounding, but there's lessons in the wounding, but there's also gifts, because, as I said, for example, the guilt wounding, the opposite of the guilt wounding is in relation to the wounded child, creates this very compassionate, empathic, and very often aware child that understands, and they often become the healers. And I see, and sometimes with students and clients, I see there's some people are very naturally aware, very empathic and compassionate, and seem to be able to see the wider picture and don't tend to jump to conclusions and make assumptions. But we also have other people that don't have that awareness. So it's always remembering that out of that pain and suffering comes great gifts, and gifts that are really needed in the world. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, comment, or share. Thank you for watching. And if you would like to check out more of my inner child and archetypal courses or free resources, check out my website at eileenburns.co.uk. Also a lot of business archetypal courses and programs at thespiritualmarketingclub.com. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week. Bye-bye for now.